Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me and for coming here tonight to be together as a community to celebrate yet another year of UNESCO status, which is fantastic. I am going to be taking you on a bit of a journey tonight. I can imagine that this is a very diverse audience. That you're here because you care about the Isle of Man, but you probably have very diverse backgrounds, very different ways of entering this kind of conversation. And so it's very easy in these contexts to sort of try and shortcut some of the messages or make them maybe simpler. So I apologize in advance that whilst I'm not going to give an academic lecture, I'm here to talk very practically about what needs to happen. What needs to happen practically does require us as human beings to lean into areas and depth of areas that maybe we haven't had to before. It's the nature of the issues that we face. And you could argue that one of the reasons we face these issues is because we have oversimplified things. And so now is the moment to kind of let the chaos in. But what I want to give you is a way to understand that chaos. Because I'm sure all of you, in one way or another, will be, and this is the picture I want you to think of that I'm going to try and give you, in one way or another, will be experiencing the unsustainability crisis. It might be because of weather events that you notice, because you're a gardener, or because you are noticing loneliness in people that you are close to. It might be because you are working in a business and suddenly ESG has come on the agenda and everyone's going crazy. Or it could be because you're just waking up every day with a little bit more tension that the way things are going does not feel good on a scale that hasn't happened before. So maybe just hands up in the audience. How many of you are feeling a bit of tension or a lot of tension around the way things are unfolding on a big scale on planet Earth? Okay, good. And it's also great to see some people that are not feeling like that. So I'm going to try and find you later and get an injection of optimism. No, but this is but this is the optimistic message. Because the message is, it's complex and it's going to feel more and more chaotic. But it is not as complex as we think that it is. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean that if we can very clearly understand and state what the real nature of the problem is, what's underneath all of the chaos, and the real nature of the destination and solution, then we're primed to lead and lead together with one voice globally. And what drives my work is because over the last 30 years, in trying to understand and work all this out and make change at the same time, very practically, realizing that there is so much wasted energy, dispersed energy, people feeling like they want to do something, not knowing where to do it, or leading, but not necessarily having the full picture. So actually maybe neutral or sometimes making things worse. And to see dispersed energy not going where it needs to go is really, for me, one of my key, very specific drivers. It frustrates me, so I'm just setting my timer so that I don't. Yeah. So my overall perception, I would say, is that to transform society and the world, we have everything we need. We have the solutions and we have the energy to enact those solutions. But what we don't have is the confidence, the unity, and the clarity to really make it happen. The confidence, because what it really comes down to is each one of us as leaders, and we're all leaders in our own way, some with more power to influence than others, to be able to have the confidence to say and embody a future that doesn't yet exist. And because we're under urgent pressure, that's quick. That means embodying something that's quite radically different, potentially. Ultimately, a lot of the stuff stays the same, but it feels different. It feels weird. You get raised eyebrows. People go, really? That's a little bit pie in the sky. It's a very ideological, but that's where we need to go if we're going to make this happen. To have that confidence, you cannot go through the 30 years that I did. It's not possible. You'll all have your own experience and background to draw on. You'll have everything you need. But it's that sense of saying, you know what? Lots of other people have my back on this. And that's where the unity comes in. You're not alone when you say those things that sound a bit weird. They have to sound weird. we're in a crazy state and normality has created it. So we need to be talking about things that are not normal, so to speak. So we need to feel like other people have our back, that we have unity around this. But more than that, and what underpins unity, you can't have unity if you're not unifying around something. So what is it that we're unifying around? And that's where the clarity comes in. And so a lot of my work has been around standards building. I've been independent for the last 5 years, having spent many years in academia and in consulting, and I still embody both of those things, working on, for example, international standards, which I'll mention, national standards, because that consensus building process is essentially one of turning a circular conversation into one that has forward momentum by saying, yeah, but what do we really mean here? But what are we really trying to achieve? When we say sustainability, what really is that? Because only then can you create an objective and therefore create strategy to achieve that objective and be able to scrutinize and judge those things. So that's what I'm here to do, help align energy and make it go in a direction globally. And I think we're quite on the way there. So I also want to hand over that sort of confident optimism and clarity about what we can achieve. Because if we spend too much time thinking about the nature of the issues we face and what could go wrong, we need to leapfrog to a different future. So I'm going to take you through a number of key thinking skills and ways of thinking about things. So the first half, I'm going to be setting the context and the scene and giving you those thinking skills. The second half, I'm going to be giving you a diagnosis tool in order to be able to scrutinize any organization that you work with. Because we spend a lot of time talking about business, charity, government. Ultimately, organizations are organizations, groups of human beings coming together to achieve something and needing resources to do it. Every organization needs money and human capital and natural capital. So one of the key things is we have to think more about what unites everything we're doing here and less on what separates. So those are the two halves. And this is probably what I would say the sort of takeaway. So if everything else is sort of like, and hopefully you'll get the slides later, and I think this is being recorded. But these are the sort of key sort of takeaway points. The economy, and this is the first key point, we all need to be, economy is the thing that we need to focus on, and we all need to feel confident about focusing on it. It should have been delivering sustainability. Get that? Huh? I'll break that down. That should be, it's actually its job. But it has been governed to achieve, ironically, the exact opposite, which we're now feeling. And we are now obviously in existential crisis, so we can't avoid it. The signs have been there for a long, long time, but we now literally can't avoid it. But we need a market economy. I am a firm supporter of a market economy. And when a lot of people say down with capitalism, they don't mean down with the market economy in the vast majority of cases. Most people do not support a group of people or AI in a room making decisions for all of us. We want the democratic freedom and efficiency effects of a market, but that market has got to work for us and not against us. And that's the thing that people don't like. And if we don't fix that market economy that is killing us, then we will lose the market economy. And then we're going to end up in a situation of command and control. Just think what happened in the pandemic. How long did it take us to go, you know what, this is all a bit too hard. Yeah, go on, just make the decisions for us. That combined with politicians, and I have politician friends, who are talking about their colleagues on the one hand saying, no, we need to leave the market free. It should do what it be able to do. We can't stop businesses. We can't, implement sustainability regulation. And the next minute saying, no, we need to lock everything down, like immediately. So the idea that we might move quickly to that situation as the unsustainability crisis, which is deeply in the room now, hits harder and harder, is something I think we really need to think about. So, and for those that support a market economy, the ideas that I'm presenting now, therefore, are not a radical change. The radical change is not having the market economy. And also that we need one that solves the problem and not just do no harm. So I'm going to touch on the ESG agenda. That might get a little bit regulatory, and there are a few acronyms in there, but it affects all of us. But that is a do no harm agenda. It's utterly critical, but it is not enough to just do no harm. And I'm going to describe, and I'll show on the next slide, a 3-level shift in the economy that I talked about at the title of this, to a well-being economy driven by purpose-driven organizations and powered by meaningful work and lives. That's the vision of the new economy at the 3 levels, and it's happening everywhere once you give it a name. And then I'm going to talk about 2 key tools which were written for any organization in any country in the world of any size that we can all lean on as, again, a very practical way to say, right, what does good look like? Because until we have that, status quo is going to win unless we have real clarity about what we want to change. So this, in essence, is the problem. So we have an economy where we have a period of time ago locked in this strange idea that financial income is a proxy for well-being outcomes. And I'm going to take us through why that is the case. So it seems so logical. It's very hard to kind of realize that that's what we're doing and that it makes no sense. But that's what we do. I won't go into the details now because I'm going to be talking about it later. So essentially, because of that, we measure GDP and say, up is success, down is bad. That's the thing that takes up the airspace. That's what we count. That's what we focus on. That's what makes us feel good or not. We have profit-driven organizations, and we have financially driven work and lives. In shortcut, maybe I should just say this now, it won't make so much sense. In shortcut, the assumptions of the market economy, and then I'll just flick over them later when I was going to talk about them. The assumptions of the market economy, the form, let's call it business as usual, that's what I think is a good way of calling it, is that we should all act in our own self-interest, and then the well-being of everyone will pop out at the end. So if you're a citizen, you are a consumer that purchases well-being in the marketplace, and you are the best person to know what your well-being is. So it's not for anyone else, certainly not companies, to bother about your well-being. That's for you to focus on. And as long as there's enough choice, you have enough information about what's out there, then you will be able to purchase that well-being optimally. The only thing that really, as long as that system's working, the only variable that really constrains how much well-being you can have, in other words, quality of life, I'll talk about that as well, is how much money you have. So that's the variable. And on a country level, that's a tit for tat, isn't it? Because it's like, well, we can make sure that our citizens can buy more in the market, more well-being in the market than someone else's. So GDP becomes a measure by which we can say you have more or less opportunity to purchase your well-being in the market. And the market, therefore, becomes the place we go to for our well-being, whereas lots of things used to be served for our well-being that weren't in the market. But we work towards that. Companies, however, are told, act in your own financial self-interest, and that gravitates towards the short term. And you are doing your best bit. And if you're making a lot of money, you must be doing a good job at meeting the well-being of society. So we moralize it. And at the same time, we say, so you must be doing a good job, and you're producing jobs. And jobs are really clearly only important because they give us money to purchase more well-being in the marketplace. And so governments are focused on finance because we think it drives well-being. Companies are focused on profits because we think it's a proxy for well-being. And at this level, we manage our companies and we start to see ourselves as self-interested people for whom the only way we can get success in life and love from others is through purchasing things that make us look good so that we have higher levels of signaling. So, and essentially, finance and money is our route to a better quality of life, and that's it. And so the system has gone for a very long period of time. I'm going to now I've set that out, I can shortcut a few things later on, but it explains why we live with this system, because we believe the myths that underpin it. And that is what's really driving the issues that we face. So if we want a market economy that works for us, very specifically, we're talking about moving from a GDP economy to a well-being economy that measures the actual goal of the economy, which I'll go into in a minute. And GDP may or may not be an important driver. In what way is an important question to ask. to purpose-driven organizations and to meaningful work and lives. Or we have a non-market alternative. And so in shortcut, this is what we all need to, in my view, see and be driving for that middle new market economy, and do it as fast as possible. And today I'm going to be talking through, the nuts and bolts of that, really, because ultimately it comes down to whether we're here or here, comes down to decision making and therefore governance. So I'm going to do a shortcut on governance and decision making because it structures everything we do, including what we do in the morning when we get out of bed, but also to what we do as the largest company. And if we can get literate about the economy and about governance, we have the tools to make the change that we need. Okay, so fundamental debunking, get back to basics, thinking skills. And this is one I think we all need to lean on. The definition of the economy. If you open Economics 101, page 1, usually just a chapter, and then it moves on to other things. What is an economy? What is an economy? 2007 and 8 crisis, you might have seen The Economist, even front cover, asking that question. What is the economy for? Suddenly we decided to start asking those deeper questions, right? But ultimately, the economy is there to take shared resources of society and transform them in a way that improves the well-being of society as a whole over time. So what is well-being then? Well, that is the question, isn't it? So that's the ultimate philosophical question that's gone back, the original, perennial question. What happened, however, is when we moved to the business as usual market economy, especially in the aftermath of World War II, where values of someone like Hitler caused such problems, it was much easier to say, let's not talk about these complex things like well-being and the values that underpin it. Let's leave the market to decide that. So we've stopped talking about what well-being is, because the market is a machine that should pop the answer out, and it's not for us to even necessarily know what it is. But of course, this is the thing we are about to lose unless we start again to understand very clearly what it is. So if we don't understand what it is, we're going to lose it. This is a definition that I helped put together from various disciplines, because well-being is everywhere when you look for it. And we can call it a positive state of being where current and future needs are met, such that there is the capacity and opportunity to flourish. And in that, you'll notice the word needs, because needs are the foundation of meeting well-being. And we know that there are universal needs. Look at the work of Max Neef, for example. There are things that no matter what human you are, wherever in the world, you need. Now, how you meet those needs, changes over time, changes over culture, but they're there fundamentally. So then let's look at the definition of sustainability and the object of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs, or in other words, the well-being, of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is the first key unlock, because with so much stuff around, well, sustainability, it can mean this, it can mean that. Ultimately, we have a shared objective that's in the room that we need to pin down if we're going to start to strategize to deliver it and to stop it being harmed. And that is long-term well-being for all. If you reword all of these, that's essentially what we're talking about. Not any old thing, well-being. What it is and how we deliver it is the ultimate question. We'll never get an answer, but we need to constantly debate it. It needs to be a pinnacle question. Not just for some people, but for everyone. You never know who you're going to be in a system. So you may say, oh, I want it for me. But when it comes to saying, what do we all think? We'll all say for everyone, because we don't know who it's for. And not just now, but in the long term, including for future generations. So if long-term well-being for all, therefore, becomes the pinnacle objective, because it's also the nearest that we'll get to as a meta purpose for humanity. In other words, if you ask enough whys on everything, you'll get there, is my guess. Ultimately, you'll get there. And so then we can start to understand that the question in the room is, if the economy is there to create well-being for society as a whole over time, but unsustainability is the definition of that not happening, what's gone wrong here? Something must have gone wrong. Of course, what we just feel, however, in our daily lives are just pressure, especially as organizations. We have threats to our reputation. If you're an organization, ESG pressure. we're all seeing the unsustainability evidence all around us. And at this point, I just want to touch on what that nature of that unsustainability is. How many of you here spend a lot of time in the fundamental data of social and environmental systems and what's happening to them? A few of you, okay. So that's another key thing I'd like to say. The real driver of our lives now and going forward, what's in the driving seat is the kind of thing I'm about to present. Everything that we feel in our lives and all the buffering and the chaos starts there. So if we want to have a sense of what's coming down the line and why stuff is happening all around us, including EU, ESG legislation, but beyond, this is what we need to anchor ourselves against. So you can go into NASA websites, UN websites to get a sense of what this is, but I'm just going to do a scattergun of some of these issues. So we know about climate change. It's the one that's in the room most. And as I'll mention in a minute, in a way that's a problem because it's not the only vitally, utterly critical, urgent issue. But if we solve for climate without the others, we have a problem. On the right here, you can see essentially this is a NASA diagram. You can see temperature anomaly over time. So this is it varied the average temperature per year, but you can see, and then there's a certain point at which that expands. On the left, this was the interim report in 2023 from the IPCC. And what this does is say what this very, very strong scientific consensus is on the type of scenarios if we go to certain levels of warming. What are the kind of system effects? And if you get the slides, you'll see these better, but it's sort of, flooding, increase in weather, precipitation. What are we likely to see? So you can look at your children, your grandchildren, yourself, to get a sense of what we're heading into, very quickly heading into. This is the sort of thing that, of course, Lord Stern and the Stern report tried to bring to us. And you can see how that temperature anomaly has changed so massively, and it's only going one direction. And remembering that the IPCC is politicized, so everything is averaged to the kind of best case scenario, and we tweak it for what we think we can cope with politically. In every case, the issues are unfolding faster and harder than the scientists, on average, are predicting. We also know this has really profound impacts on us. So if you're an investor, if you've got a pension, this also hits home at that level. This is just the impact on land values to 2100, which is not that far away. Italy, which is one of the most biodiverse in Europe, the most biodiverse, set to lose about 60% of land value. Now, these are not being costed into the models yet. So while insurers are starting to say, we're not sure that your home's worth that, and we're not sure we can value, that's not reflected in market prices, and people are walking into huge issues. We also know, however, that despite clean energy growing massively, as we know, 7 countries now have their electricity is fully renewable. Only 7, and and their electricity is not everything. So we're a long way off, but we know that we are still increasing. Last year, despite everything, over all these decades, emissions still went up. And that's all that matters. The climate doesn't care about what our plans and our transition plans are. It just cares about that. And that's going up. And of course, we can understand what's behind that, because in the 5 years since the Paris Agreement, investment in fossil fuels has gone up, not down. So we're saying one thing, we're doing another. Why? How are we doing this? Are we so crazy? And this is what I want to help us unpick. In terms of social, because of course, long-term well-being for all. Our well-being relies on a healthy climate, of course, but it also relies on a healthy social system. And the environment a healthy environment relies on a healthy social system. And we know that our social systems are not looking good at all either. So this is in terms of wealth inequality, and it's definitely worth going back and digesting this, because it's so profound when we really think about it. That whilst all wealth when we're born on planet Earth is ours shared, ultimately less than 1% own 41% of all wealth in the world. And 3% of wealth, nearly 70% of people have only 3% of that wealth. And I can tell you that probably all of us are in probably the top 1 or 2% of wealth. You don't need, it's surprisingly low from our perspective, the amount of assets you need to fall into the top percentage. So that's another key message. We are the problem and we are the solution. So the hope is here with us. And we all feel like we can't, just like Obama felt like he couldn't do anything when he ultimately got to be president. But we are the only real route to hope, and the people without access to the education resources are relying on us to make the change. And we know that wealth inequality overlaps, and this is where the nature of social structure and stability and security comes in, because we know that the richest 10%, and that's us, account for nearly 50% of all climate emissions, but you can take that across other ecological impacts as well. And so the point at which we start to realize really what a carbon budget is, really who's spending it and in what way, we can just imagine the Sun headlines. They will come. They're starting to come. And that's not going to be pretty. So these things interact very clearly. And then let's just take one other thing, in terms of social costs that's also a result of the issues that we face and our way of decision making, is that mental health costs up to 5% of GDP, just dealing with mental health. Now, we're not talking about the real impacts of mental health, just the cost of cleaning up on some level. And I'm sure you all know people with mental health issues, and that only gets you so far. That doesn't clear it up. But the systems and structures, and in many ways companies, I'm sure, like me, you all understand what I mean when I say that are perhaps creating these problems, are not paying for these problems. And that is a perennial issue I'll go back to. And then let's just one more. But you can look at the planetary boundaries, donor economics, which looks at social and environmental, or the SDGs. They're all basically kind of expressions of this suite of issues. But let's look at ecological breakdown. On scientific terms, honestly, this is more urgent than climate, which is a crazy thing to say, because climate is so super urgent, but it is. Humans and their animals, 10,000 years ago, 0.1%, and it's now 96% of animal mass on Earth. And it looks something like this. So we are crowding out nature. And we look at our fields. I come from Devon, I used to love looking at the green fields. And then I went to South Africa, and then I realized they are green deserts, And but we have come to think of that as wild. I don't know if you've seen that gin advert on TV. The wilds of Hereford or something. Oh my God, surely that is like wilderness washing or something. Someone's got to do them for that. They're terrible. It's not wilderness. But the result of this breakdown, so biodiversity loss, we are in most assessments say that we are at or in the 6th biggest mass extinction on the planet. The last one was the dinosaurs, in terms of the rate of species loss. And that comes from habitat fragmentation and other things. Does anyone know what this is? It's what, sorry? What? Apple, sorry? What? Cotton, no. So it looks like cotton, no. It's an orchard. Does anyone know where it is and what's happening there? Yeah. Yes, hand pollination, which is also happening in parts of California and other places. So the reason is because of you've probably heard of insect apocalypse, in Germany. I think 75% of flying insects are lost, and I don't think it's much different here. We all remember what it was like when you were driving in the sort of 70s with and they're not there anymore. And it's nice because your ice cream doesn't get although sometimes it does, because that balance of insect population means you have some species that dominate at certain times. So ultimately, though, this is really serious, and it's also serious for feeding the world, because can you imagine what this costs compared to insect populations? And so there are a suite of issues. They are all about, we cannot, no, I'll say this first because I'm going to talk about that. Energy is at the heart of this. So on the one hand, this is about the energy we've come to use, the cheap fossil fuels that underpin absolutely everything around us and what make it so hard to change. Cheap energy. 1 barrel of oil, probably about $10 actually to extract and use, maybe slightly more, and 3 weeks worth of manual labor in it. Crazy. So we chose to burn fossil fuels for a reason. If we deal with that, we get rid of a few issues. We get rid of air pollution, not all of it, some of it, lots of it. We get rid of climate change, we get rid of ocean acidification, and we get rid of geopolitical stability that's related to that. But, and this is the key unlock, if we went clean energy tomorrow, which is often seen as the solution, what issues do we still have? Exactly. Now, that overlaps with climate, and global warming makes that much, much worse. But it is a standalone issue that is to do with how we use the energy. And that's the bit we find really hard, which is why we like dealing with climate, because we can put it into our existing system. It kind of works. We can kind of count it. We can kind of trade it. And because it's about just swapping out a source. It's not about dealing with what we do with the energy and how much energy we're using. And that's where it gets tricky. But if you solve for this and not that at the same time, we don't have the luxury of that. We don't. We have to deal with these issues all at once, and that's another key message. So we have to avoid this, saying, yeah, sustainability, carbon, climate, end. We have to. We have to be thinking. We have to let the chaos into the room, because it's in the cupboard, and we can't just say, yeah, we think we can deal. All these issues are weighing down on us, but I think we'll just let climate change out because we can deal with it. Because this is what's really driving the agenda, and it's not going to wait for us. So we have to, and we cannot ask businesses to transform their whole business models, or us our whole lives, just to deal with climate change, to then 2 years or a year later go, now we're going to ask you to change everything again for biodiversity and then water scarcity. We don't have the time. We'll just drown in the bureaucracy. So this is also about letting the chaos in so we can properly clean up the mess and do it so that we retain the market economy to help us to do that. So where did we go so wrong? Okay, so that was part one. That's the context. And I'm just checking the time. Yeah, we're fine, aren't we? Yeah. So I'm now going to move into how can we start to really understand precisely why we've ended up in that mess and what we all can do to help address it. So maybe just before I move on to that, very specifically to what I've just covered, were there any things that were not landing or not clear or anything you want me to unpack a little bit more? Or shall I move on and we'll do the questions at the end? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, great. This next bit is about the technicalities of decision making. But it is, I say it is the most practical tool I can give you that exists in my view. So, unsustainability happens because of routine decision making. Decisions are what create effects. And decisions that we make routinely are going to create lots of effects, especially if we make them all together, and lots of us make them. So when we make routine decisions, we tend to have a sort of underlying logic as to why we have those decisions. There are lots of organizations that I would say are very, very badly governed and managed and schizophrenic, and decisions, there is no culture. There are lots of subcultures and nothing really, underpinning the decision making. But where you have any kind of culture that says, yeah, this is what we do, you will have routine decision making. And there are three types, to boil it down, three logics of decision making that you can apply to any organization, from the smallest to the largest, from government to charities to large business. And these logics dictate how much we're going to be probably harming our sustainable future and our potential to be able to address those issues. And that latter bit is really an important thing. So this is about realism, really. Let's be realistic about what we can expect if we have systems of decision-making that look like these three. So the first one we can call business as usual. I talked about the business as usual economy. It's a way of making decisions about the economy on a routine basis. And as I said, and I'll represent that in a triangle in a minute, this is about short-term self-interest. That's how it's self-interest, but it's gravitated to short-term, and usually financial self-interest. Then we have a second business as usual, which is actually about, everything is the same, but it's about long-term decision-making, a long-term self-interest. So understanding a little bit more that if you want to feed your self-interest, you're going to have to take care of a few things, otherwise that's not going to work. And then thirdly, purpose, which is a paradigm shift, because at the heart of it, it is about a motivation and an intent to serve another, not to serve the organization itself as the core point. And that's the key switch. So before I dive into those three logics, and I'm going to use a triangle, that triangle is also at the beginning of the British Standard in Purpose-Driven Organizations. It's in papers I've written for Cambridge that you can freely download online. So it might seem a little bit whoa at the beginning, but I can guarantee you it's a useful tool for you, so please do use it. But first, I'm going to distill in 3 minutes, ISO 37000 on governance. So you may or may not know ISO. Probably some of you have heard of ISO and the ISO standards, right? So really, all ISO is 170 countries' standards bodies, which in the UK is the British Standards Institute, coming together and building consensus on any topic. And any standards organization is all that. It's a highly refined consensus building process. That's all it is, on any topic. Just happens to be that it used to be about plugs and widgets and still is, and then it moved to things like environmental management systems. But what happened was we got to sort of like the pinnacle question, which is governance. Because once you start to think of the whole organizational system and not part of it, you're in the realm of governance. Lots of standards were kind of mentioning top management and sort of blurring executive and governance. And in the end, it was like, this is too important. The world started to realize that the scandals, the financial scandals, but also the environmental scandals and the issues we're facing are really a governance failure. But what is governance, right? Now, governance is actually a young discipline that grew up in the business as usual era. So our understanding of governance is actually anchored to the very issue that we have. So ISO 37000 was basically the world saying, we're ready to be able to say definitively, fundamentally, what is governance for any organization, not just corporations, which includes charities and things, but any organization, and what does good governance look like? What are the principles? And I led that process. It took 5 years. There were 77 countries, 25 liaisons involved, over 2,000 comments that we resolved. Sleeves rolled up. What do we mean by? What is accountability? What is governance? What is an organization? What definitions are we going to use? And then what are the foundations of governance? What is the governing body's role versus the executives? Where do we draw that line? What's the guidance? And we got there. We weren't even sure we would be able to, but there was very strong consensus in the end. But the foundations of governance, we all need to know. So this is the definition from ISO 37000. Governance of organizations, a human-based system by which an organization is 3 things: directed, overseen, and held accountable for achieving its defined purpose. So there needs to be a defined purpose. The middle principle of ISO 37000 is purpose, and you can go and look at that. And that has to be anchored to stakeholders and what is important. So it's the first step towards purpose, which I'll talk about in a minute. But these 3 things, directed, overseen, and held accountable. So you have to direct, but then you have to oversee whether you've achieved your direction. And you have to be accountable to others as to whether or not you have, and any corrections you've made, and like what you're doing about it. So everything really hinges on direction. And direction is really the heart of decision making. So in any decision, is that like getting up in the morning, what am I going to do? Oh, I'd like a cup of tea, that's my goal. Or an organization of the largest kind, or a government or a nation, there's a reason why people come together to do something. We sometimes forget what that thing is, but there is a reason. Otherwise, we should just all go home, right? So what is that thing? Now, that could be at the biggest level, but it's also nested at every level of the system. What is the thing you're trying to do here? To achieve what? But for what? To what end? To what end? So what is the goal? And that's based on our assumptions. What we think we're trying to do is often based on just our worldviews about what we think is valuable and how to protect it and how the world works. But we usually encode that in an organization. But any goal is achieved within parameters, constraints, limitations. That can be the law, but that's a choice. That's a voluntary. You choose to obey the law. It could be things you can't control. It could be your values. We want to achieve that goal, but we won't treat people this way by doing it. You know, we can treat them up to here, but not less than that, not worse than that. It could be carbon emissions that you're going to produce. There's a limitation there. We can do anything to achieve our goal, but this year we can't emit more than this much carbon. These are all decision-making parameters. And if you're in an organization of more than one, you need to be really explicit about the goal and the parameters at all levels of the strategy-making system, because strategy, which ultimately ends up in investment, action, and impact, because it's that sort of organizing bit, we can only talk about strategy if we know a goal and we know the parameters. Because if you don't know the goal and don't know the parameters, how can you do strategy? Because strategy is, how do I achieve the goal within the parameters, given the current dynamic context and realities that I face? And that strategy could be, I want to make a cup of tea, I only have 5 minutes and I have no milk, what am I going to do? What's my strategy? You know, as simple as that, to the biggest 10-year, 50-year, 100-year strategy. And it nested it. It could be the marketing strategy, the sub-marketing strategy, you know, whatever. It all nests. So the reason why we need to know this is because the reason why we have gone so wrong is a governance issue, and therefore governance can fix it. So we've had the wrong goals and the wrong parameters that we've been governing. And this is what brings me to the triangle. So there are no more graphs like this. This is but I'm going to explain 3 logics, the reason why we've gone wrong, what unsustainability is, how we can fix it, and the role of governance through this triangle. So did anyone heard of Herman Daly? He was the original ecological economist. I had the privilege of engaging with him the week before he died on email. He was very much looking at the whole economy level. And one of his key pieces of work, and Donella Meadows from Limits to Growth then took up his work. And that's why I wrote to him saying, you know, I hope you know, but I'm really like playing around with your triangle and bringing it into the organizational level. But he was very supportive of that. Because Donella Meadows looked around and said, look, of all the things we can use to describe the economy and unsustainability, what are the best ones out there? And she also arrived at this. So what he said was, we are stuck in the middle of the triangle. So when I said logic 1, business as usual, short-term self-interest, this is really where we are. Because the objective, so the optimizing goal, as I said before at the beginning, is financial capital, financial income. That could be at the individual level, the company level. If you're a university, even if you're a charity, you see it everywhere. Or counting student numbers, you know. Anyway, I'm sure you've all experienced this yourself. As really the fundamental, if you dig into it, the core objective. And the reason we do that, like I said, is because we somehow believe the assumptions that that's all going to make our lives better, right? So we moralize it. And this then, however, is the really important point. The objective is financial capital, but the core parameter is stocks and flows of financial capital. And it's important because we get that mixed up, and we have to be better governors and managers if we're going to fix this issue. We get mixed up. When we say, yeah, but profits are important, do we mean, I'm like, yeah, but do you mean profits as an optimizing goal that you're innovating to achieve? Or do you mean profitability in terms of enough flows of financial capital to achieve that goal? And usually there isn't clarity about that. But we need that clarity because if it's different management functions, it's different ways of doing. If you are saying we're going into a market to make as much money as possible, have we got the stocks and flows of financial capital to do it? They're two different skills. So, but what we've done is basically govern within this. So companies are literally, and in many ways, at least normatively and in Delaware, forced that is their objective. And the parameter, stocks and flows of financial capital, think of all the regulation, financial reporting. What are we really requiring companies to do? It's that. That's what we ask them to count. We don't ask them to do much else. So this means that the ultimate objective of the economy is out of sight, but actually it's off limits. As I said before, we've said to companies, your role is to meet demand in the market. It's not to understand well-being. That's actually wrong. You should not be trying to change customers, even though companies routinely do through marketing. It's another area I think is vital that we understand. But we actually say, no, don't go there. Don't care about it. As long as there's a revealed preference, deliver it. And of course, we've had 70, 80 years of influencing preferences and what we think is well-being for the purpose of profit maximizing. So what comes back and say, well, customers want it, is a perverse result of all those years. Now, down at the bottom here, this is not costed. So the foundation of the goal of the economy, the ultimate objective, is not in the parameters of decision making. Because we don't say, as long as it makes enough money to keep us going, invest in the purpose, meet the expectations of our stakeholders, pay the bills, but also is sustaining and building our human capital, is sustaining and building the inputs of natural capital, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't count these. Now, some of you may know in the last 10, 20 years, International Integrated Reporting Council, triple bottom line, multi-capital accounting, it started to come in, but it's a nice to have. No one's obliged to do it. So we basically, these parameters. So you run a system that's curtailed and squashed, and you supercharge it, and you run it for 80 years. Why would we not end up in the mess we're in? With products and services that might or might not, but often don't, actually make our lives better, or could make them so much better, but we can't even see that gap. And foundational systems, and at the bottom there, the environmental and social systems that we all share, the capital inputs that are not financial and the stakeholders that are in a degraded state, and now severely degraded, because we have basically been asset stripping them, turning them into financial capital and calling it success, and applauding ourselves for it at all levels of the system. How were we ever going to not end up in this mess? But in understanding that, we can understand the solution. And that's what really matters. I mentioned this before, the assumptions of the business as usual economy. I won't say that again. But asset stripping has become the norm. So that last statement that I said, this is the work at the Harvard Impact Weighted Accounts group that are doing some fantastic work to basically just reveal that obviousness. Others have done it as well. But they did an assessment 2020, nearly 1,700 of the top companies, and said, just taking some environmental costs, are these really profitable? And 15% unprofitable immediately, even though they post profits every single year. And 32% would have 25% or more reduction. Now, that doesn't include the mental health costs, for example, that we're talking about. So this is why we're in a mess. But in the last 15, say, years, at least since the 2007-08 financial crisis as well, this has happened. There's been this shift to this long-term self-interest. So it's like, well, actually, what's really going wrong? Everything with all of the assumptions about the market are fine. The issue is just that we've somehow become, because of the financial markets, we've become really short-term. So if we want to we can make as much money as possible as the goal, that's absolutely fine. We believe that that works, but we've now just got to make sure we're thinking about how we do that in the long term. And in doing that, you bring all of, or at least start to, should bring all of the bottom of the triangle into your decision making. When you're stuck in the middle of the triangle and unsustainability issues rain down on you, the only way you can act to resolve them is if there is a business case to say, this affects my short-term financial self-interest. If you can do that, you have a business case, you'll probably get it through. That means, however, that the only actions that happen are those that can clearly be shown to have pressure on financial self-interest. And that depends on what stakeholders are shouting the loudest and able to exert pressure, which is why you get CSR, which is the smorgasbord of activity, like volunteering programs and trying to get high up on the ESG rankings, or sponsoring something, like something or other. It's because, and the only thing that really holds that all together is, will this protect and enhance our short-term self-interest? Which means if the pressure goes away from the stakeholders, the reason to do that goes away, and you have nothing there. And it means that essentially, unsustainability is hitting that very unfertile ground of decision-making, and everything is being filtered through that. But this second decision-making frame, this long-term enlightened self-interest, essentially allows the business case to expand. So suddenly you can say, yeah, we can make a different decision with our supply chain and give them a different deal because we need them, because if they're not healthy, we're not going to be healthy. So we're going to protect our stakeholders. We are going to, we're going to actually take care of our staff and invest some money there rather than strip that money out of the organization, because we need those staff, And then actually we also need a healthy climate. Now we have some organizations that are, you might say, immature enlightened. So maybe they start to worry about climate change or staff mental health. But really, those are just two of many of those issues at that bottom of the triangle, and all of them are critical for all of us. And that essentially is the ESG agenda. So any of you been watching what's been happening in the ramping up of the legislation on ESG? Does ESG mean something to, yeah? So partly what I try to do is to help, and I do this with senior executives all across the world, is to help them to situate what we really mean by ESG, what it is, what it isn't, what it needs to look like. So ESG is essentially the forcing of these parameters into governance of organizations. So it's essentially saying, if society, so it started off as an investment, investors care about whether they have long-term investment or short-term, but this is the same data that society needs, and it's the best data that exists. So essentially, if society is using these mechanisms to ultimately say, you cannot exist as an organization unless you can prove to us that you're not asset stripping us by existing. So it's the do no harm agenda. That's what ESG is. And you can put the SDGs, donor economics, planetary boundaries, it's an expression of what's the minimum conditions of health. Now let's encode those into organizations. Because when we talk about climate change and 1.5 degrees, we're not talking about what a really great climate. We're talking about what's the absolute minimum we can get away with. And really, most of the SDGs about that as well. They're not what we really want to optimize for. They're what are the minimum conditions. Now, the ESG agenda, but just to say that, of course, the ultimate objective and all innovation is still curtailed by only if it makes us as much money as possible. So this is the ESG agenda. It looks something like this at the moment. It's evolving very, very fast because there's a sort of like mad panic as the penny starts to drop and everyone goes, oh my God, yes, seriously, we are literally killing ourselves. What do we do about it? So it has gone from 0 to 60, but it's not comprehensive enough. It's not broad enough. The EU's leading the charge, but in other parts of the world are also moving very quickly. So don't let anyone tell you that it's, that the US is going to somehow kill it. I mean, that makes me laugh. Until we actually deal with the issues of the degrading social environmental systems, this is not going anywhere. Because that's what's driving this. Anyway, I'm just going to mention this because I think it matters because it affects everything. So this year is the corporate Sustainability Reporting Disclosure Act, which means basically large companies in Europe need to disclose the harm that they are doing or not across their supply chain, and on lots and lots of measures, up to 1,400 metrics. And it's across the supply chain. So if you're involved in a supply chain of your large European company, you can expect that you will be asked lots and lots of questions soon because it matters. Now, at the same time, this is the Sustainable Finance Reporting Disclosure Directive. And what this is doing is saying and there's two parts to it, but the point is it's saying on all these issues, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, marine, water, circular pollution, and biodiversity, we want you to tell us, if you're investing, you need to disclose, there's no choice on this, you must disclose whether your investment is sustainable or not. And by the way, we have a thing called a taxonomy that tells you what is sustainable or not. And a sustainable investment is one that firstly has to proactively do some good, right? But mostly importantly, and we'll talk about purpose in a minute, that's a little bit, but this is the most important thing, that the investment does not significantly harm any social or environmental objectives. Wow, that's a game changer. Must not harm any social or environmental systems, basically. And follow good governance. Now, it's still evolving, and it's still new. But you can see this is essentially the bottom of the triangle. And it started with climate change, which is most evolved of these, but it is coming on everything. And it's coming to you. And ESG might be about the law, and that's now the new compliance agenda. And by the way, that new compliance agenda is not ticking a box. It's compliance, but not as we know it, because to comply with not asset stripping systems we're used to asset stripping is total business model transformation. for nearly every organization, yeah, massive. But this also goes beyond the law. So this is one of many, many litigation acts. I mean, you should hook in, maybe in LinkedIn or something, to the evolving situation. Incredible what's being, the judgments that are being made across the world now. But this is an ongoing one where a Peruvian farmer took a German energy company to court in Germany and got the case heard, and it's still ongoing, to say, you have produced, RWE, 4% of fossil fuel emissions over a period of time or whatever. Therefore, you are responsible for the fact that my farm is not functioning anymore because of climate change. And the judge, in saying they would hear the case, said, even people who act according to the law must be held responsible for damage they cause. So the shifting norm, because judgments are basically reflecting the norm, is that even the law is not keeping up with the norm of the big laws like human rights. And that's what people are using to say you're breaching human rights, and they're being successful in it. So basically, we have to deal with everything all at once because it's not a choice. We're actually not in control, and we have to accept that. We have unleashed the issues. We now just need to deal with them. We therefore need systems thinking. And actually, constraints and getting this all on the table can hypercharge our innovation. Constraint is the mother of innovation. So let's get those constraints properly down, and let's really rethink our business models and our economies and our governments so that we can actually create something that really is aligned with our long-term well-being and isn't destroying it. But where will we get the motivation for that? How are we going to solve that if our system of governance is saying, only if it can be proved to affect my self-interest can I do something? Otherwise, I literally don't have a basis on which to act. And that's where purpose comes in. So you've probably heard of purpose-driven organizations, and the concept of purpose been coming up way through the ranks from especially people like Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the biggest investment company in the world, but in so many different ways, massively supercharging. And you can probably guess this is the third logic, and it is a game changer because essentially, rather than relying on the market to pop out well-being for all, it's a sort of like, hang a minute, that's not working very well. I'm not sure we can rely on that. So we need to anchor our reason to exist, not as financial self-interest, but as a contribution to long-term well-being for all, the goal of the economy. And then we use the market and we make sure we have enough financial capital to achieve that goal. And let's remember, as we said at the beginning, companies, organizations are in service of society to take resources and do something good with them for society. So it makes sense that they're governed on the basis of whether what they're doing with our resources is actually of any use in the first place, even if we weren't in a crisis. But given that we are in the mother of all crisis and we need innovation and change in society at a massive scale, and businesses are those, and organizations of all kind, are those we endow with the ability to take resources and innovate. How will we solve these problems without that? Without organizations not just doing no harm, but actively solving for our long-term well-being for all, which really should always have been the case. It's just about that no one was governing or asking companies to govern themselves to make sure that the economy was doing its job. So we have an inefficient, ineffective market economy that's not working on its own terms. And the consequence is that humans on planet Earth might not persist or have any quality of life. So, just at the end now, I'm just going to tell you a little. I have a few more slides on purpose. Are you all still with me? Is this? Yeah. Okay. Fine. Great. Then we're going to start to sort of now say, okay, so that's the problem. That's the solution. That's where we've gone wrong. And now, this isn't just like, oh yeah, that's a shame, isn't it, what we can do about it. There's work being done everywhere and over a long period of time to actually address that. And there are tools that we can all use. I mentioned that before. I mentioned ISO 37000. These are the countries that were involved. These are the 11 principles. You can kind of ignore the outside circle. That's some of the governance outcomes. But the others are the 11 principles. And each one of them using language that works across the world. So this standard has also been translated into Spanish, into Romanian, into Chinese, into various countries. So if you want to understand how to do governance, even if you're a small organization, it needs a bit more translating, but it's the same principle. Yeah? then that's, and also if we want to hold each other to account, if we want to hold ourselves and, to say, well, if you are a well-run organization, on this principle, what is it that you're doing? Now, there is a gate fee to ISO standards. It's their business model. So they fund a large part, but they fund a large part of the activity they do, which is quite costly through that. I'm trying to make this standard be for free, but I believe, for example, through your Chamber of Commerce or maybe through other routes, you can probably buy one and then everyone can get access to it. But there's also online some very good summaries of it and groups you can join. But this standard is fully free. It was actually sponsored by BSI, and the chair of the board was very, very supportive of it. Now, this is the British standard in purpose-driven organizations, worldviews, principles, because worldviews underpin principles, and behaviors, which, as a result, will deliver sustainability. Here are some, including KPMG. I was chatting to someone earlier in the Chamber of Commerce from KPMG, was part of that, but also so was B Lab. You've probably heard of B Corps. So B Corps and others like it are sort of, you might call, on-ramps, but on-ramps to a destination which has up till now not been clear, and that's what this does. It clarifies what is it we're aiming for. And yes, it doesn't quite exist yet, or some organizations can do parts of it. But why would that be able to exist when everything around us is structured for the middle of the triangle? But if we're not clear about what we want it, what good looks like, we'll never achieve it. We'll never be able to make it so. So that's what this does, and you can see the definition here. Now, this definition, and the reason organization is in brackets, is because you can use this at any level. You can use it for a brand, a department. You can use it for yourselves. Because it is a reason to exist. A purpose is a reason to exist that is an optimal strategic contribution to long-term well-being for all people and planet. In other words, sustainability. In other words, the goal of the economy. In other words, humanity's meta-purpose. So you can't do everything. And the idea that purpose is meeting the needs of all stakeholders is not true. It is about being very precise and transparent about what it is that you exist for, and being able to measure it and be transparently accounting and the impact that you are or not creating, but then doing it in a way where you're also managing and being transparent about your stocks and flows of financial and non-financial capitals, as well as your impacts on social and environmental systems and stakeholders. So it's the whole triangle in a standard decoded into governance behaviors, the governing body and executive managers and decision making. And there is the plan that this will go to ISO soon. So this is the very practical call to arms, you might say, because we all have an opportunity now. If that goes to ISO level, it'll go to a 3-month vote, and if it gets through, I'm the designated project manager, which means I will be sort of convening that process. Up to 170 countries can then look at PAS 808 and go, yeah, yes, no, we think, and maybe it will end up completely different, and that's fine. The important thing is we will have a shared language about what good looks like in terms of governance, and we will see each other across the world because we call it different things. Even before the word sustainability was around, we knew when something wasn't working well for our collective well-being. If we can come together and realize what I see, which is massive global shift, rebelling against the essence of this system that's not working, and all work together, then we really can move at speed. And all the seeds that have been planted, I'm sure in your own ways, you're doing lots of things and thinking, yeah, but what's the point? But those are seeds that have been planted. We now just need to bring that energy into the right direction. And of course, purpose, as well as just strategically aligning decision-making, what it does is it unleashes humanity back into an organization. One of the issues we have with business as usual is because we've assumed that we're self-interested, and usually financially self-interested. That's the way we've run our organizations. And now we start to tell ourselves even, yeah, but it's never going to go well because we're just so self-interested. But we've been telling ourselves that for such a long time. So people like Rutger Bregman, who've written the book Humankind, to sort of debunk a lot of that. We've got to remember that we ultimately, and the research shows this, are driven by wanting meaningful lives. Those are purposeful lives. And what that means is a life where we feel that if we didn't exist, others' lives would be worse. In other words, that we make people's lives better, and therefore us existing is useful. So that warm glow when you pick up a pencil for someone or open a door and someone thanks you, and you think, I made someone's day. That's great. That feels good. That feeling good is our superpower. But in organizations, we've said, no, you're coming here to help us fulfill our self-interest, and we expect you to fulfill your self-interest, and that's how we'll treat you. But we know, and Daniel Pink and others have done research, finance is a hygiene factor. And it's mostly, and of course, money is a symbolic good. It can never be an end in itself, ever, because it's symbolism. But what it does is it tells us, yes, we value you. We think you're successful. We think you're better than the next person. So of course we're fixated on it. But only up to us, even with that power, only up to a certain point. What really drives us is purpose. And why lots of organizations are purpose washing is because they see the power that purpose done well in an organization can bring stakeholders on. It can increase productivity levels up here. It can reduce stress down here. Because people who are engaged and care about what's happening will work 100 times more, put more into trying to achieve that goal and get more out. The idea that we work so that we can then, and we drudgery with our work so that we can go and buy our well-being in the marketplace. These are the days of our lives, and we know that that work is an amazing thing that we can do if powered. So Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, he was one of the core people that talked about this. Success, like happiness, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And it does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. So it's a good life, and of course that gets very spiritual very quickly, because that's pretty much what all spiritual leaders have been saying for a very long time. That is what is the essence of a good life. So what a happy coincidence, huh? That actually by creating organizations that align with our sustainable future, and that is the untapped resource, that in order to create long-term well-being for all, we just to tap into the fact that we want to help other people achieve well-being. How marvelous is that? And CEO views are changing. So this is a KPMG survey done just after the pandemic. Which of the following best describes your view of the overall objective of your organization? 1,300 CEOs. And the questions they ask map perfectly to the three logics. So deliver economic returns to shareholders, logic 1, 11% only said that. This was an anonymous survey. Embed our purpose into everything we do to create long-term value. They mean financial value here. Really, this is about, this is enlightened self-value. 69%. But 21% to advance public interest and improve society, which is essentially being purpose-driven. So what people really feel is the objective and what they say it is. And of course, we saw that with Paul Polman and Unilever, very much playing the game, saying to shareholders, yes, we're working only for you, but really saying to everyone else, this is our purpose. And in the end, saying, we exist to do this. Shareholders, don't invest in us if you don't agree with it. Just literally go somewhere else with your money. Now, he only had some success in that, but still, this was as a PLC in a fast-moving consumer goods company. He really broke a lot of ground. So, and there are lots of, here's some illustrative example paper I did. There are examples, of course, Ørsted and DSM literally took the structure of the organization, which was an oil and gas company, and changed everything inside. It's now a healthcare company, renewable energy company, everything. Total transformation. So if anyone asks, yeah, but how do you do that with a company that already exists? There are case studies out there. And this is my last slide. What are the leadership capabilities that we all need to make this happen? So there are lots of ways of cutting this. These are just some that I think are really important. So we really need clarity of those objectives and parameters. And even if those objectives and parameters are in the middle of the triangle, let's be clear about them. Let's not pretend that there's something different to what they are. We need to focus on the science. We need to be clued up. We don't have a choice not to. And actually, if we make strategy without knowing that, it's junk strategy. It's just junk strategy. You cannot be a good governor or leader unless you know the science, in my view, in this day. You need to have the confidence, as we talked about. Consistently, not taken off course by short-term events, to have that persistence. Be competent with complexity. Not just say, well, you know, we can't deal with that now. We've got too many other things to do. It's like, if that's important, let's get it all on the table. and then create psychological safety. So having an organizations that feel safe to fail, to experiment. These are fundamentals. You've probably heard a lot about that recently, but it really is. We can't move forward otherwise, and that's it. So if we need to build this together, and these are my takeaways, but and resources that you can look at later. So thank you. There was a lot in there. I do. I warned you. I did warn you. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Victoria, my name is John Shepherd from Sustainable. I was born in 1946, so I grew up post-war in a sustainable society, effectively, a caring, sustainable society. And over the years, over the decades, I've gradually seen that erode as we moved into this pyramid selling concept of consumerism, where effectively money, possessions became more important than people. And as with all pyramid selling schemes, eventually they collapse, and we are at the point of collapse very clearly at the moment. I mean, what you've expounded on tonight, I mean, is a significant ray of hope. I mean, whether we as human beings can ever actually, stop killing each other and actually basically do something as positive as what you are showing here, I don't know. I mean, personally, I've been trying. I came to the Isle of Man first in 1976.
I was born there.
With my wife, who's a journalist, and we bought it as a holiday home over here as a holiday home. I mean, my father had been over here, and during the war, he was on a light cruiser called the Manxman, and so he had an incredible feeling for the Isle of Man. Basically, we moved, when my wife became very ill, we moved out here full time in the 1980s. And one thing that struck me immediately was the Isle of Man was very much like I remembered London in the 1940s and 50s. Mm. And the core reason for that was that the island had usury laws, which the UK abandoned in the 1850s. So effectively, there was a limit on how much interest could be charged on loans, which effectively meant that there was only one estate agent on the island, and effectively houses were so cheap. And when we bought a 4-bedroom house in 1976 for £5,500, and we sold it in 2003 for £365,000.
So things have changed a lot, and
things have changed dramatically. But when that legislation was removed, effectively, suddenly, property in the Isle of Man became an amazing investment opportunity for people with capital.
So what do you feel are the things that we can do now, then, right, given everything? What would you like to see happen now?
I mean, what my analysis of the situation in the Isle of Man, although it's broad, it does go into the British Isles. And through working with Hans Eek, the Swedish architect and physicist, who was, basically founded the Passive House movement. What I've seen at the moment is there are a lot of groups in the Isle of Man with very narrow interest, and those interests are to maintain the status quo.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying, and absolutely, and I think hopefully tonight that gives us at least, because partly this is about empathy and forgiveness, because we're in this together, and we need to understand why are we trapped in these ways of making decision, and helping bring the fact that we have a shared agenda here. So, for sure, I think the more that we can listen to each other and with a shared agenda, though, because the problem is without that clarity, we all get hung up on the strategy, and it all gets very micro and ideological, because we're not clear about what our shared objective is. And I think if we can do so, that would be my recommendation in general, is the more that we can remember that actually we do have a shared goal, the more we can make that clear, the more we can move towards it. And obviously things like passive house. Yeah, I think we have an issue obviously in the UK with existing housing stock. And this is not just about building new builds that actually don't asset strip the owners going forward, but retrofitting. And for sure, that's definitely an interesting one. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, yes, it's Mark L. I have I grew up in Africa, and I was born in the 1950s, but I've seen an uncontrolled growth of the human population. The human population in 1950 was 2 billion. In 2000, it was 6 billion. Now it's over 8 billion. And whatever, as a chemical engineer, you take a direct correlation between the consumption of resources on a finite-sized planet and the growth of the human population. And I've never heard this actually being addressed by the environmentalists. Indira Gandhi brought in one child per couple. She tried to bring that in India. Mao Zedong brought it in China. There were all repercussions of that. Yeah. And yet we still have an uncontrolled growth. And when we start looking at housing stock, and we start looking at all the resources that are consumed across the planet, there's almost a direct linear correlation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I think the conversation of population is always in the room in various ways. Again, I think this is about clarity. I think if we're clearer about the parameters for our discussion, it becomes easier. And also because it's easy to chuck the baby out with the bathwater, or so some thoughts. Firstly, what really is the correlation driving the population growth is really the use of fossil fuel fertilizers on land. In other words, the green revolution, as it was called, which meant the growth in agricultural growing, which was basically because we could take land that wasn't fertile, put a load of fossil fuel fertilizers on it, and it would be as if it was fertile. And that's the basis of our agricultural system. We know that food production drives population. And if you look at that correlation, that's the real correlation going on here. But what we're doing is we're saying, while people demand food, we must give it to them. Again, middle of the triangle. We're here to serve demand. Now, that's obviously not an easy one to resolve. But when thinking about the problems we face, there are at least a few statistics and things that I think are really important. Firstly, to remember that an analysis, I just saw another analysis by a very credible organization just last week. We actually could all have a high quality of life if we changed how we did things with the resources that we have. The issue we have, again, we're trying to solve the problem from the mindset that we have, is that we're like, well, seeing as we're stuck in the middle of the triangle and we can't go anywhere, how will we do that? Because when we look at that funnel of the consumption, it's actually, the issue is the world cannot achieve well-being through the kind of very wasteful consumer approach that the market pops out, because that's the way we decide that we need to achieve well-being. If we actually said, as organizations, how do we best take these resources to make our lives better? If that was the question in the room, and that's what it is for purpose-driven organizations, you'd come up with very different ways of innovating the system. The issue we have is we have not been asking the right innovation questions to get the right answers. That's not to say that we can keep growing our populations. It's just to say that it's consumption, bias, and aspirations, and the way that we consume that is the problem more than the population, but we also have to deal with the population. The other thing to say, finally, is when we talk about population, I think we also have to be very careful to start at home. To say, fine, you're on an island, UK's an island, great, let's have that population. Let's not talk about what other countries should do. Let's start with us. Are we sustainable in terms of our population? What does the right population level for us look like? How much are we having to import? Is our supply chain good or not? Then I think let's have that conversation, but let's make it very personal. So we're not here judging other people's decisions on that. Yeah.
I totally agree with you on what you said about purpose and the rest of the presentation. I just never hear the human population growth being discussed, which to me is the elephant in the room.
Totally, yeah, I agree with you. It needs to come in, and in a sophisticated way, I think, because otherwise it's just people huddling together going, that's the real issue, but actually it's complex, yeah, thank you. Oh, we have a couple. Lady there. And then afterwards there's a lady here. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. I wonder if you have any advice for smaller businesses. It feels like often they're driven from the top and the bottom of that triangle in terms of being driven by purpose, but then navigating through the systems of society end up having to focus on the center of that triangle in order to survive. And I wonder if you have any advice for businesses on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to recognize that. We are constrained by our stakeholder constellations. And sometimes to be purpose-driven is to have to put on hold what you know the market needs because the market isn't quite there for it, and engage at the system level to change the conditions through which, or do both at once, for sure. I would say that therefore, and in that vein, and it's not a solution to particular. So firstly, I would say being very, very clever about and very good at marketing. And that, I mean marketing not in sales and marketing, price, product, promotion. How can you really, if you've got something valuable that the world really should care about, how do you make people connect with it emotionally so that they do care? So a lot around that. But in terms of then saying, look, okay, we might have to sacrifice on a few things on our business model, but we know that this is coming, but we're going to engage at that systems level. That's where PAS 808, the British standard, comes in. If you go on LinkedIn and put PAS-808, and put in groups, look at groups, there's a group which is an implementers group of organizations of all sizes that are starting to work with that and support each other. That comes up all the time about small businesses, and we keep saying, and there are people starting to organize to say, well, how do we create a guide for PAS 808 for small businesses to make it clearer for them? Because really, the more that we can move towards purpose-driven organizations, the more we level that playing field. The way we move towards there is by making all of us realize that's what we need to fight for. We need those organizations, otherwise we lose the market economy. And so bringing that energy together and clarifying and also eking out the purpose washing in the system. Because until you're clear about PAS 808, for example, people can get away with, yeah, we're purpose-driven. But now you say, well, okay, so what are you doing on this then, and this and this? So it's not a great answer, but it's just to say, and unfortunately, the winds of change. When people, I've been presenting this stuff for a long period of time now, and in the past, it was like, oh, that's a bit theoretical and a bit ideological and a bit utopian. And it's like, and over the years, I haven't changed what I'm saying, and everyone's going, yeah, that's really practical and explains everything, and this is why we're having problems. And so the world is changing, and unfortunately, I know I come somewhere like this. For some of you, these things will have been going in your head, and this will have landed lots of things. For others, it would have planted seeds. For others, you may have no idea what I just talked about, but it's fine. There will still be seeds planted. But the reality is, if I came here in 2 months' time or a year time, and you were the same people, you might feel completely differently. Because unfortunately, the winds of change and what's coming our way, what's in the room, but we're in a bubble, so we don't always see it, is huge. And it's going to move us more and more towards your kind of organization. So keep the faith, but be strategic, and don't take toxic finance. Do not allow, we talked about powerful stakeholders. Make sure that anyone who can influence your decision-making is on board with what you want to do. Otherwise, don't bother. And please, can we create more non-toxic finance that can help organizations like that? Sorry, there was a lady here, and then there's a gentleman at the back. Yeah.
My mind has had a spring clean. But I've long thought that the economic models that we've got are not the right models for the world we're moving into. But I am interested because while I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, but what about Russia? And what about China? And what about Gaza? How do you feel that these huge political problems fit in with what you're saying?
Well, the reality is, whatever we're trying to do, there will always be events, firstly. There's secondly, the realization that what I was talking about, some of those issues at the bottom of the triangle are in the driving seat. And we know from history that tensions that are created from social and environmental breakdown is usually what's at the heart of most wars and conflicts. It is environmental scarcity or constraint or social breakdown and constraint. So whilst people will always have, tension and wars and bad leaders and all the rest, we know that if we don't deal with that, that's going to get worse. So this is probably our biggest issue now. We had a few decades where, because like you say, in reality, if you look at the footprint of the world, we now need, in the UK, I think about 3.5 worlds to sustain our lifestyle, going back to the consumption thing. In the 1950s, it was 1 world. So we were at limit, but we were actually, the world was biospherically sustainable. Yeah. So the point is that we are now in a situation where the risk is that as leaders, and I talk to you all at leaders as different levels here, that we are distracted by the noise and the chaos from the fallout of this system, and we are not able, therefore, or even less able to deal with the underlying issues. So I would say, if we, a bit like, what's that? There's a prayer, but there's also, it's someone else that came up with it. Give me the capacity to change the things I can. Don't worry about the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. So starting, and one thing I would say, if you can tap into your purpose as a human, what is it that you want to achieve with your legacy for the world, given the state we're in, and given the fact that we are, as humans, are born at the most amazing time. Amazing in the amazing, like as in spectacle, horrific and wonderful at the same time. But what a time to be born, to see this unfolding before our eyes in a very short period of time. And to recognize, like I said there, that we are in the top 2%, that we have more power than we think we do, that if we looked at our sphere of influence, it's bigger than we thought that it was, and how we could expand that is greater than we could. So let's get our ambitions up here and not down here. Don't tell us ourselves that we can't do things and we can't affect. And it's a fair question, what about Russia, what about China? What can we do with our sphere of influence and if we build it? Because we know, and there's another, Margaret Mead, I think, said that the world, don't ever underestimate what a small group of committed people can do to change the world, because it's the only thing that ever has changed the world. And that's why this message is there to help galvanize that, because that is not a small group of people that actually care about this. It's huge. But we need to have the bravery to step out of this box. I did say a lot in my answer, it's true. So I probably answered a whole heap of questions there.
I think this might be the last one.
I'll try and be quick.
Yeah, maybe ask the 3 and I'll do my best, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering how you saw the idea of risk in ESG topics fitting into your pyramid. So you talked a lot about purpose in ESG and these regulations as a way for organizations to look at purpose, almost in a way that's kind of external to them. And I wondered what your opinion was on things like the US Security Exchange Commission trying to get companies to report on things that are equally as important to stakeholders as finance, like the climate
Yeah, so
risks
that was all the bottom of the triangle. And that is the risk agenda. It's the do no harm risk, that logic too that says, oh my God, we're not going to be able to make money if we don't sort out this issue. There's a risk. So that whole risk narrative, the whole ESG, the whole is about how do we get within these minimum thresholds. But we're not talking about it like that. At the moment, we're saying report some stuff about doing no harm, but we're not even going to really properly clarify what that is. So we're just feeling our way, but it's all of that. So, yeah.
It's a question of sustainability. I was born in the Isle of Man in 1959. I've seen a lot of the countryside disappear under housing estates. The government wants an increasing population. We see prime farmland being built on, which should be growing food for the increasing population. How sustainable do you think we are?
Only you can answer that question, but I hope I've given you tools to be able to genuinely ask that question of yourselves in a positive and constructive way where you are all on one island, that and it's a wonderful context, especially with your UNESCO Biosphere, and the fact that as politicians, you act as independents. You're not bound by some historic party politics. What a wonderful opportunity for you to come together to create the future together. So I support what you're, as politicians, it's not an easy job, And you as citizens, it's not an easy job either. And one thing I would say for sure, governance is a nested system, and it starts with citizens as the governing body. And we delegate to government to govern on our behalf. And then government govern organizations and tell them how to govern. So we, as citizens, including as government, you're also citizens, yeah? How do we govern government so that government can do the job that it wants and needs to do? Because a lot of politicians, sorry, I know we've got politicians here, but we have a lot of politicians who are stuck in that middle of the triangle, if nothing else, because everyone around them is telling them to be there. So let's break free of that, yeah. And then, sorry, there was one final.
Well, Phil's just asked a similar sort of question I was going to ask, which is basically about, well, for me, it's frustration with the Isle of Man. That it seems to be a lot slower to react to the climate crisis than some other jurisdictions. And it's partly also because we're smaller. Sometimes we don't get invited to certain conferences as well, the global conferences. But anyway, I thought, first of all, what can we do on the Isle of Man to progress that agenda? And what can I do legally to use legal means to push it? What can I do to put pressure on, like that Peruvian farmer?
Well, okay, so again, this is, you know, this is your home. This is you're the one family here. This is, you know, this is for you to work out. And luckily, in this forum, we have a wide variety, including politicians, including citizens that are caring about these issues. You wouldn't be here if you weren't in some way interested about this. So hopefully, this might have spurred some multi-stakeholder conversations. But what I would urge you to do is, before you start any of these conversations, be really clear. What is the ultimate objective that you're trying to achieve? As many Ys high towards long-term well-being for all. And maybe in the context, long-term well-being for the Isle of Man. What does that, if that's the objective of every conversation in every room, you can then say, what's the bit we're doing here? Because then you start with your shared agenda, rather than starting with at-odds agendas, when actually it is one family and one island. So that's all I would say. I'm sure the efforts are being made, but this is the time to go one stage further. So that would be my thing. Whatever you do, try and build empathy and unity. It's not about being right. The solutions, the strategy is going to change constantly. We need to have the infrastructure to be able to debate and to bring our ideas and to debate that strategy and hold it to account. That's the most important thing, not whether one solution is better than another. For that, we need the governance frame that I mentioned here. So focus on the governance frame. Don't spend all your energy on pushing for a strategy. Get the infrastructure for conversations working first, I would say.